Greetings, Mandrake Road Church. So we began last week taking a look at the topic of Sabbath. And this is a topic I've been thinking about and writing about and looking at for the past year, a little over a year. And I think this time during the COVID-19 crisis gives us a very good opportunity to explore the topic of Sabbath, given that we are almost in a situation where we're being forced to practice Sabbath to some degree. And so I want to take a few weeks and look at this topic and then, as we did last week, have some time to meet online on Zoom and do some discussion questions about the material. And so last week was just a basic introduction. We watched the Bible Project video, and today we're going to begin looking at various texts that help us think about Sabbath. And usually the place to start would be Genesis 2, 1 through 4, where God rested after creating the heavens and the earth. However, we're actually going to end with that text, and I will explain why at that time. So here in 8 weeks, you'll need to come back and see why I decided to close with that text. Instead, today we're going to start with the Ten Commandments, which keeping the Sabbath is one of the Ten Commandments, and it helps frame Sabbath in a way that goes beyond the idea of potentially just taking a day off. And so I think it's good that we start with a framework for how we might engage and think about the Sabbath. And this will be something we do for the next couple of weeks. We'll look at text to kind of help us give us an idea of what Sabbath is and give us a little deeper introduction than the Bible Project video did. And some of the texts that help illuminate what Sabbath is and what was its function in Scripture and for Israel. And so the Ten Commandments in general, we have, many of you have probably heard sermons or classes, and many of them we know by heart. And so with Sabbath, though, Sabbath is one that doesn't get a lot of attention, at least in sermons or classes that I've been a part of, but it's actually quite crucial. Sabbath actually serves as a bridge. And you're saying, a bridge to what? Well, if we look at the Ten Commandments, the first three focus on God, and then we look at the final six. Commandments 5 through 10 focus on our relation to other people. And so, honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. And those types of things. And so, if we were to think about these in terms of a nice, neat package, the greatest commandment comes to mind. So to love God and love your neighbor. As we look at the Ten Commandments, they're kind of on these axes, right? The vertical axis being commandments that pertain to God, and the horizontal axis pertaining to our life here on earth in community with others. And so as we look at this, we see that Sabbath actually contains, the command for Sabbath contains both of those things. And so I'll go ahead and read and expound upon that briefly. So Exodus 20, 8 through 11 reads, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son, or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. This shows that you keep the Sabbath because it reflects something that God did and reflects something God desires for creation from the very beginning. But also it reflects our relationship to those around us. In this case, children, ourselves, for an ancient Israelite, potentially slaves, and in our case, maybe we think of employees or other people we work with, but also people who are coming through town. So when it says an alien resident in your towns. And we see this being one that contains both the horizontal and vertical aspects of the law of loving God and loving your neighbor. And so I want to camp out there for a few minutes. And this takes us back to what's going on in the Exodus. It's easy to come to the Ten Commandments and forget what's happened so far. Well, they're out of Egypt now, but over the course of a few chapters, earlier they were still in Egypt, and we see this moment where the Israelites are making bricks for storehouses to house this grain in Egypt, but just to house Egypt's wealth is how we'll think about it. Their surplus. And Pharaoh, over time, continually increases their workload. And so they have to make more bricks. And not only do they have to make more bricks, but they have to go get their own straw, which they didn't have to do beforehand. And so their work has doubled. Their expected production quota has increased, but they still have to meet that increased production quota and still have to go do more work. They still have to go out and get the straw necessary for creating bricks. And over time, their taskmasters, those overseeing them, are supposed to push them harder, and they're supposed to work longer. And that goes on, and this is an everyday process. And so what Pharaoh does in the ancient world, we see that earthly realities reflect heavenly realities. So what Pharaoh is doing is mediating the Egyptian gods' purpose for the world, and in this case for the Israelites, in that they are to keep the economy going. They are to keep everything moving smoothly, and that means they cannot stop working. They have to continually work. And this reflects the glory and what we would say is the God's blessing of Egypt and Pharaoh. So we're seeing this, that now it becomes this competition, these gods who are constantly calling for Egypt, and in this case, the Israelites, to produce the bricks, but also produce more and more wealth. It's something that is in direct competition with the God of Israel, who calls for Sabbath, calls for rest. And this is a culture that is not abnormal. It's something we see in our own Western world here in the United States. We see a culture of production, of consuming, and monetizing of everything. And recently, when my wife and I did our taxes, we were asking. So those of the church do know that Katie is pregnant, and we had to ask when we were filing our taxes, what the welcoming of our child, what will that mean for our taxes. And there's a pretty set amount. And if mom decides to stay home, there's a pretty set value there. And so I made the joke, oh, y'all are worth such and such. And that was it shows though how our culture does assign value, and usually in dollar amounts. And we tend to, at times, assign value based on people's ability to produce, consume. And that's something that was very similar to what we're seeing from Pharaoh. And so this is a cultural aspect that we live with every day. And we live in a economy that is supply and demand, and there has to be people to demand things, but also people to help produce the supply. And so the main driving factor of our economy is, in this case, is people, and then capital, right? So the monetization of all of these things and people and their ability to produce and consume drives our economy. Now that's a little reductive, but we're gonna stop there for now. And so the question of how does this reflect? So we see this the love of God. Sabbath reflects love of God in a way that it shows that as the Egyptian gods demand work, the God of Israel demands to rest at some point. And that reflects a time when, as we saw last week, that upon being cast out from the garden, that humanity now becomes slaves to the land, and we talked about that as just work. This reflects a time when that is supposed to reflect a time when that's not the case. And so when we see this idea of love of neighbor, and we see this connection to, is that the thing that comes after, when it says you are to not work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female slaves, your livestock, and the resident alien in your midst, is these tend to, slaves, children, livestock, these are properties. These are all property. And so as we look at that, it's saying that to give them rest, it demonstrates a certain value that goes back to seeing them as creating the image of God. But they're not just commodities or a means of production. And that puts this in a perspective that when we think about the world in which we live, and I have worked for and played sports for people who, if you're not working, if you're not working, you're losing. And to some degree, that can be okay. And work is good. That's clear from working 6 days and resting one. That there's nothing wrong necessarily with work, but it has to be given its place. And God desires us to have a view that does not allow production and consuming and wealth in general to take God's place, but also to treat those around us as objects, as property, as we see here, that it gives us a different view of people. And so Sabbath broadens, it's not just a day off. It helps us reflect on a time when it helps us reflect back to what God intended for creation. And so as we explore this, I hope we can keep this framework in mind, okay, that Sabbath is helping us broaden other aspects of who God has called us to be. And so practicing Sabbath is not just a time to disengage. It's a time to reflect in a different way than the world tends to push us towards. And in our case, and in is the Israelites' case in Egypt is one that sees the world as a means of the world and people as a means of producing and consuming and generating wealth. And so I hope this will give us something to discuss. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. But next week we will be looking at Leviticus and what it means to let the land rest. So I hope you have a good week, and we'll talk to you later.